And with that, I would now like to pass the session to our presenter for today. Alison, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon and good evening everybody. I can see that we are joined by nearly 500 participants, which is fantastic. So I do hope you are all well wherever you are zooming in from. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to lead you through this webinar on how to teach Cambridge Primary online. So a really big welcome. I can see already by looking at the chat box that you are already experienced Zoomers because you've already been putting your name in and which country you're based in. If you would also like to add which role you are currently occupying, please do so, just really so we get a sense of our audience, and also perhaps what you are looking forward to learning about today as well. That would really help us. And as Salisa has just mentioned, please do try and use the chat box or the Q&A box to some questions and answers at the end of the session as well. And as also, please do use the chat box to ask each other questions or perhaps even to support me as I'm working through the slides. If I'm commenting on something, please do comment back or offer suggestions to other people as well. So it is really, really lovely to be with you today. The format for today is going to be around about a 30-minute presentation from me, and then we'll allow 20 to 30 minutes of questions and answers. And I'm really grateful to my moderators, Salisa, to be able to help me out there. I will try and keep an eye on the chat box, but those of you who have been doing some presentations like this will know that even that multitasking option is quite tricky. Just to give you a little bit of information about myself, so I've been working with Cambridge International since 2011, absolute privilege. I'm a consultant for them, and I think I was counting up the other day, I've managed to support about 22, 23 countries, which is just fantastic. So if somebody's is with me today, joining me today, that we've been able to meet in person, please do say hello to me. I'm currently zooming in from the UK. So at the moment, I've just had breakfast. It's the morning for me. And because I'm English, I'm always obsessed with the weather. So I can tell you that at the moment, it's a lovely sunny day in England, which is lovely. I do love the sun. You'll see also on the slide that we have got two objectives that we're going to explore today. Really thinking about how that online learning can provide us with that great flexibility and those opportunities, both for learners and for teachers. And I'm really mindful that, in the current situation that we find ourselves in, we really need to see this situation as an opportunity. So to be able to develop new skills, to be able to think really innovatively, really creatively, and perhaps even use those Cambridge learner and teacher attributes that we're always kind of talking about. So let's make sure that we can be responsible and confident and innovative and so on. And our second objective is really to think about using that Cambridge primary curriculum and thinking about, so how am I going to use it, whether schools are open, whether they're closed, or whether, of course, we're going towards that mixture of both, that blended learning model that I know lots of you are starting to move towards as well. And although this webinar is timetabled for primary, I think everything that we're saying today is very suitable also for lower secondary as well as upper secondary. So, please do kind of comment on that if that's coming up as well. So I think one of the things that we really need to think about as we are thinking about how we might teach the Cambridge primary curriculum and framework online is thinking about altering our expectations. So as you will appreciate, the curriculum was written to be delivered face-to-face in the classroom. However, we are really lucky with the Cambridge curriculum in that it is very flexible, it is very adaptable, and so although we might need to think a little bit differently and we might need to alter our expectations, we are starting with a really good solid framework to do that from. And what I mean by altering expectations, I really don't mean lowering expectations, absolutely not. Our expectations need to be maintained as high as possible, that they would be as high as they would be in the classroom, but we just need to think a little bit differently about how we might set up tasks, indeed what objectives or activities we might be choosing from, and so on. And I'm really hoping that as we go through this webinar, I'm going to give you some really good tips on how to maybe think a little bit differently, where we're altering our expectations of what we expect of ourselves, but also of our learners, but also maintaining those high expectations that we are all involved in, which is fantastic. So just a reminder, we do now have 10 primary subjects. Now, if we had longer, I might ask you to put in the chat box all of those 10 subjects. But I will just mention them for you here. And the reason I'm mentioning them is that I know that lots of you won't necessarily be accessing all 10 subjects, but this could be a really good opportunity. If, for example, you haven't had an opportunity to explore the fairly new music primary curriculum or art and design curriculum, this might be an opportunity that you now find yourself in that would be useful to have a look at in the current situation. So just as a reminder, the 10 subjects are English, mathematics, science, global perspectives, I'll come back to, art and design, PE, physical education, digital literacy, music, English as a second language, and ICT starters. So we now have that suite of 10 subjects, all with curriculum frameworks, teacher guides, and so on. I also wanted to just pull out global perspectives, because actually this is a really, really powerful subject that is a skills-based curriculum, which actually is going to be very helpful potentially in the situation that we find ourselves in. So we know, for example, that learners are going to have to access tasks a little bit differently. We know that things like research and collaboration are very, very strong skills that we might need to think a little bit differently about. So if you haven't yet had an opportunity to have a look at the Global Perspectives primary curriculum, perhaps now is also a really good opportunity to do that. And it might also help you looking at some of the tasks, some of the projects, certainly the 6 skills that are involved in Global Perspectives when you're planning other subjects, for example. I also wanted to mention the current support that is available through Cambridge as well. So of course we do have the specific primary support sites. So if you haven't visited that primary support site on the website recently, please do go and have a look. They're constantly being updated and changed and edited. And of course we also have the primary forum. Now there are lots of forums which you will find on the school support hub, but primary has its very own forum as well. And we have an amazing team of people who are sitting at the end, not literally, of the primary forum, ready to help you, ready to answer your questions. So it's a really good way to you engage and contact and be part of the Cambridge family. There's 2 other places that I want to mention as well that will really, really help you. And the first one is the teaching and learning page when school is closed. Now you will find links to this on the homepage of the Cambridge website, the international website page, and you click on the link, and I've just included a snapshot for you on the screen of the 4 areas that Cambridge have absolutely populated with amazing resources to help you when school is closed. So for example, go and have a look at those tools to support teaching and learning. There's lots and lots of webinars and online training. There's also the resources and the ebooks. So if you haven't yet had a chance to visit that page, please do so, because it is absolutely packed full of really high quality information, resources that would really that although some schools are still closed at the moment, some of you might now be heading towards a situation where potentially some of your schools might be starting to open, or indeed starting to move towards that blended model that I mentioned earlier. So Cambridge have been really responsive again, and there is another link on that homepage which talks about teaching and learning when school returns. And again, I've just included a snapshot for you so you know what you're looking for, but again, you can see the 4 areas that are currently there that hopefully will provide that support for you. Okay, one of the most frequently asked questions that I think I've been involved with in the last 4 months is, so how do we adapt the textbooks, or how do we adapt the learner books, or indeed the curriculum frameworks when we are teaching offline or virtually? So I just want to go through and give you a couple of tips on things that you might want to think about. So the first thing to say is that if you're using textbooks or indeed learner books, of course the books do provide you with a structure, but it's really just remembering that you can alter this. You are in charge of that textbook. So just because the author of the textbook has decided that something goes here and something else follows it, you can switch those around. And I really want for you to tie that into your school scheme of work. So again, there are recommended schemes of work for those 10 subjects that I mentioned. But again, because Cambridge is so flexible and so adaptable, one of the things that we would absolutely encourage everybody to do is to have a look and see how you can adapt it to fit into your situation. Now, we've been saying that for years, and it seems like an even more obvious thing to say now. So for example, have a look at your, let's take science, your science scheme of work. And depending on kind of where you are, whether you are about to begin a school year or whether you're halfway through or etc., have a look at what's coming up in the next month, 2 months and 3 months, and ask yourself, is what the scheme of work, or indeed the textbooks, is what they're suggesting that you would do in the next 3 months suitable for your situation? Now, if your situation is still online learning, virtual learning, then it might be that some of those activities and some of those objectives that are in the scheme of work are not necessarily the best to choose from when your learners are still at home. So please feel free to really adapt and edit and move things so that, for example, what might be in the first 3 months, you perhaps are shifting things to the latter half of the year, for example. So it's really kind of owning that scheme of work or owning the textbook and really making it work for you. Be selective on the tasks you select, because again, just as I was saying, there are some brilliant tasks that actually are really helpful for you to do and ask your learners to do when they're at home, or indeed when you've got a blended model where perhaps they're having a week at home and then a week at school, or a couple of days at home and a couple of days at school. So really starting to think about, so what I'm asking them to do at home, can they do that? Do they have the resources so that when I have them back in school, which could be tomorrow, could be next week, could be in 3 months' time, actually I've made that scheme of work and those textbooks work for me. And I've had a look at the schemes of work, and there are certainly lots and lots of activities that I could just tweak ever so slightly to really think about, well, okay, we're not going to do that particular science experiment that I would use specific equipment for in school, but I can still look at changing states, for example, by looking at asking learners to notice what happens when an ice cube melts, for example. So again, it's just that kind of that altering that expectations without lowering it. I think the other thing to say, of course, is that when you're using textbooks or learner books, you don't have to replicate everything. And sometimes we feel as teachers so conscientious to make sure that we cover everything and we cover it really well and in depth. But of course, you've got a huge amount of things to cover and you don't have to replicate it. You don't even have to cover the entire curriculum in terms of kind of, you know, absolutely everything ticked off. Really kind of think about, have you offered your learners the big picture of things? And including in that, I really want to stress the skills as well, which is why I mentioned global perspectives a little bit earlier this morning. we just kind of move on again, keeping with that same theme, but a few more tips. It might be really helpful for you to audit what your learners do have at home, because we can make assumptions about what we think learners have. And again, just kind of saying to them, do you have equipment to write with? Do you have any paper to use? What is your situation? Do you have whatever it is that you're asking them to have a look for? So again, just, perhaps carrying out an audit. We would do an audit in school, so why not do an audit at home as well? Rethinking those timescales, again, what I was mentioning on the previous slide, have a look at the scheme of work or the course textbooks as a year of work. So just because it says that you need to do something in the first semester or the first term, actually, we might need to alter those expectations and turn it on its head and think, well, yes, that would be better if it was done in the first 3 months, but actually, that's not the best use of time. I'm going to switch things, move things around, and rethink those timescales. Something else to think about is that, of course, when your learners are still learning at home, they are going to need some more independent tasks. And again, it's something that we really not necessarily resist at school, but we know the power of working with peers. We know the power of collaborating. And of course, your learners are going to be able to collaborate online through platforms like Zoom with breakout rooms and things. However, we're going to just need to think a little bit more carefully about selecting those more independent tasks. And certainly when people say to me, well, I haven't got enough time to get through the framework, or I haven't got enough time to get through the textbook, what I get a sense that they're saying is that I can't do every single activity or every single task. And I guess what I'm saying is, you don't have to. It's about really thinking about, have I given experiences of the learning that I want? Be able to do 5 tasks linked to this one objective. At the moment, I might just be able to do 1 or 2 tasks. So again, that altering of that expectations is just really important, just to have a little think about that as well. And also, I can see that somebody's really helpfully popped into the chat box that, those independent tasks, keeping that mental health of learners is really important as well. And I totally agree. So again, it's kind of that really helps me to lead on to that next bullet point on the slide, which talks about breaking tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks. One of the things that we've noticed for our learners when they're learning online is that they're not able to get through the same quantity of work, of learning, of tasks that they are in school. And actually, we were doing a webinar last week that really kind of unravelled this and unpicked this a little bit more. But certainly, the things that we would have got through in school, for whatever reason, we can get through more, we can get through things in a little bit a different way. That doesn't necessarily happen at home. Raft of reasons there, but certainly I would encourage you to look at tasks, look at the learning, and break it into smaller, more manageable chunks for your learners. It's really important to be clear, and when clear in terms of giving your learners instructions. And again, I've noticed giving when I've been supporting teachers here and helping them with some of their online teaching, we think we're being really clear, and then the learners produce something and you think, did they read the same thing that I gave them? And it's just that, that misunderstanding, that miscommunication, because we're not using our body language or eye contact in the same way. And we do take on slightly different personas when we are using this medium of communicating online or virtually. So it's really important to be overtly clear. To you, it might seem that you're being, really clear. But again, think about it from your learners. Is there a way that they could misinterpret or miscommunicate what you mean? Because what we really want to do is maximize any learning that's going on at home. That's really important. So one of the things to do, for example, is to perhaps screenshot or embed pictures into some of your presentations so that your learners can see exactly what's happening. And of course, primary learners may also be lucky enough to be supported by other siblings or other adults at home as well. So we're really trying to give those people as much information as possible so that they can also help us in their role as temporary teacher at home. Something else to think about, again, it's that altering of expectations, is thinking about pedagogy. And one of the questions that I've been asking teachers that I've been working with is, how will you change your pedagogy? Because we can't necessarily employ the same pedagogical techniques that we would be using if we were face-to-face in the classroom as if we are online learning. Now, of course, some of them are going to be replicated, but it's just being a little bit reflective on the things that you would have done in the classroom. How is that going to be translated for online or blended learning? So that big message about learning at home is not the same as learning at school. And if I had a highlighter, I would be highlighting that, because it is different. And again, that's where I come back to that altering of expectations. So we do need to be mindful about the situations that learners are in, the amount of work that we're asking them to do. But of course, that scaffolding and that modelling is really, really super important. It's one of the things as teachers that we do exceptionally well. We are very, very good at scaffolding some really clear learning points, or modelling, perhaps, you know, where we're modelling how to add some numbers together, or talking about fractions. We're modelling how to do some guided writing or some reading techniques. So we model, we scaffold, we give our learners a chance to practice and problem solve. So those things are not going to go away when we're learning and teaching online, but we might need to think a little bit differently. And I think one of the things to really think about is that big message that we have, a bit of a Cambridge golden thread, as I like to call it, that, you know, we really still want to encourage our learners to be actively learning as much as possible. And I know it's really tricky to maintain high levels of active learning when we're learning online, because the temptation is to do what I'm doing now and talk to you, and you are listening, but you're listening passively. And you're listening passively because I haven't asked you to do anything, I haven't paused, I haven't got you to engage in certain ways. And partly that's a time issue that we have today, but certainly when I'm in the classroom and I'm teaching those students, I'm very active that, have I caused them to think? Have I really caused them to be learning in that cognitively active way? What we might think about is that metacognition. Have I asked them to think about what it is that they're doing? So certainly, you know, really try and think, well, how would you be doing this in the classroom? More than the students? If so, we need to switch it. And that message is still the same when we're learning online, but it might just need to be a little bit differently. We might need to use different strategies, for example, to encourage our learners to engage a little bit more. And actually we're doing a webinar tomorrow, which will pick up a little bit more of those pedagogical techniques. Keep the tasks simple, keep them shorter. This isn't that you're watering down the learning or lessening those expectations, but you're just being mindful that that pedagogical approach is different from face-to-face teaching as it is to online teaching. So you can get through the same quantity, but in smaller chunks. So again, it might be really helpful to think about what you want your learners to learn over a period of, say, a week, rather than, well, what I want them to learn in this lesson. If they were in school with me, by the end of this lesson, they would have learned this. Actually, we might need to think, well, I'm going to give them 2 or 3 days, or indeed a week, to really have a think and engage with those bits of learning. Quality feedback, it's really, really important. Your learners are desperate to know how they're doing. They're desperate to have that contact with you. So that feedback is something, again, that Cambridge values, you know, as much as those active learning and metacognition strands, because that quality feedback is what gives us our formative assessment. And we know that formative assessment is super helpful, both for the learners to be able to engage with and critique how well they're doing, but also for you to know what to plan next. So that quality feedback, really important. Again, next week we have a webinar dedicated completely to thinking about formative assessment in the online arena. And the other thing I wanted to really talk to you about as well is that, again, I know that there is the pressure to get through the curriculum, whether you're learning online or learning face-to-face, but just remember that prior knowledge is as important as new knowledge. And it might be that, particularly if you're thinking about a blended model of learning, that actually that prior knowledge is something that you can draw on and use more of when your learners are learning at home. And then you've got that new knowledge saved for when you have them in the classroom. And equally, if that model, if that blended model isn't something that you're heading towards in the near future, you know, hopefully we won't be in this same situation in a year's time. So really think about going back to that scheme of work that I mentioned earlier and thinking, so what could I shift to the latter half of that scheme of work, so that hopefully if I have my learners back with me in the classroom, what new knowledge, what kind of resources do I really need to use in that latter half, and therefore thinking about at the moment, the current situation, the future, the near future, that prior knowledge is really helpful. So really kind of making sure that you're setting up quizzes, getting your learners to recall that information is really important. I wanted to give an example of kind of the change of pedagogy, and I've used writing for this example. And again, it was one of the things that I was thinking that, you know, we might have some really confident writers in school, and you would know who they are. You set a task and you almost know the quality of the work they're going to produce. They're very confident, they need little scaffolding, but don't assume that just because they're confident writers at school, they will still be confident writers at home, because, you know, lots of those scaffoldings and the modelling that I was talking about earlier could be the reason why they're so confident. And if we're not providing those elements in the same way, that might cause our confident writers to become less confident, and also the other way around. So it's just being mindful that we're not necessarily transferring those same characteristics that either we have or our learners have between those two situations. But here's a few tips that I wanted to share with you about how we might change our pedagogical approach and alter our expectations. So the first thing to say is that if your learners are writing, brilliant. That in itself is what we want them to do. The whole purpose of writing is to write. So it might be that in the online situation, we don't worry too much about the technicalities, the punctuation, the grammar, because when we're giving that feedback, what we're really, really proud of and excited about is that our learners have been writing. We can deal with the technicalities when we have them back in school. It might be that we really want to use this situation that we find ourselves in a really positive way. So we might use some different contexts and different mediums. So think about all of the different contexts that we could inspire and encourage our writers to use when they're at home that we wouldn't necessarily use in school. So can they write a diary, you know, in the day of somebody that they're living with at the moment? Can they make a list of something that's really unusual, I don't know, going to the supermarket or going on a walk? These are the things that we might not use at home, and we certainly wouldn't find those necessarily in the textbooks. But here's a situation that's presented itself, so let's make the most of it. I'm hearing at the moment that quite a few learners have engaged with writing e-postcards. What a lovely idea, setting up e-postcards, actually writing e-postcards to each other. And I noticed that in the chat, somebody had said the power of peers working with each other. Absolutely. I wonder how it feels to receive an e-postcard from one of your classmates. You know, really lovely, really powerful. You probably want to respond. And then we've got a lovely situation where our writers are writing to each other. It might be that you set up some collaborative writing projects. So for example, you know, you put your learners together and you say, actually, I want you to talk to each other through whichever mediums you're using, and I want you to write a collaborative piece of work. So again, we might not necessarily be doing that in the classroom, or we might be doing it with big bits of paper. So we're just shifting that pedagogy so that we're maintaining those expectations, but we've altered how we might set it up. The other thing to think about is that I don't know what you find with your learners, but certainly some of the learners that I work with, particularly here, find it really tricky to edit. So they've written a piece of work, the last thing they want to do is to edit it. However, editing online is much easier than editing on paper. So I'm now thinking, well, actually, perhaps I need to do lots of editing work while I've got the situation, the online situation, because typing something, going back, editing it, using the spell check, using the grammar function on the computer, for example, is really, really helpful. And just because the computer is aiding me doesn't mean that it's doing all of the work for me. I'm still having to think, I'm still having to reflect, and I'm still editing. So again, you can see how we've just shifted those expectations. And of course, using writing partners. Just because we were using writing partners possibly in school doesn't mean that we have to stop, but how will we change that pedagogical approach to ensure that that type of pedagogy is still operational? So hopefully that's just given you a little bit of an example about how we might think about changing our pedagogy. Not all of it, because we know that the majority, being skilled, trained teachers, we can just adapt and move to different situations. But we will just need to think a little bit differently in order to teach that Cambridge primary online. Again, just, wanted to highlight that thinking differently, thinking creatively, thinking imaginatively. Almost, not quite the learner and teacher attributes, but certainly let's make the most of the situation. And so the big message here for this screen is that not everything has to be screen-based. Now that really helps us with synchronous and asynchronous learning as well, and certainly giving us the idea that we might maybe over a longer period of time than we would have in the classroom. And the examples that I wanted to give you, just 3 examples about, we talked about science a little bit earlier. So we know that we've got some science objectives. So let's have a look at the ones that we can really explore and have a go at while our learners are at home, but maybe using kitchen science, for example. So there's lots of opportunities to do kitchen science, looking at cooking, looking at changing states, even things like toasting bread. What happens when you put the bread in the toaster? It changes state. Can you explore it? Does all bread do the same thing? Can you set up an experiment? Let's think about opportunities for mathematics outside. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is taking maths outdoors, but we don't tend to do it when we're in school because we've got other tasks that we would do when we're in the classroom sitting at desks. So again, let's have a think about, so let's go and do some sorting and classifying of things that we can find outside. What different shapes can we see? Are there more 2D or 3D shapes outside? Can we find any examples of tessellation? How many different opportunities do we see for numbers out and about in the environment? So again, I'm still getting through the curriculum, but what I might have done is changed some of the tasks, some of the activities that I'm enabling those learning objectives to be met by. And street art, actually, let's think about, we might not have access to paintings, although hopefully we could have a look at them online if possible, but let's go outside and let's take a sketchbook, let's take a bit of paper, let's take some chalk, and let's do some street art. Let's have a look at that designing. Can we see something when we go on a walk that really appeals to a design sense? So we're thinking about, why did the person design the building in that way? And so again, hopefully connecting that learning to real life situations. And again, I've mentioned a little bit about group work. It's something that, again, within the Cambridge primary curriculum, we're very, very keen on. We know the power that group work has, learners helping each other, collaborating, communicating, explaining, reasoning, thinking. And I have to say, I think your learners need group work more than ever, because although a few slides ago I said we do need to think about some independent tasks, we also need to think about connecting our learners as well. What we don't want them to do is to lose those skills that they had pre-COVID. So we know that they were great at sitting in groups, talking to each other, sharing ideas. So how can we carry on and facilitate that in the online forum? So breakout rooms are one of the ideas there that we can use. With lots of the different platforms, they do those types of things, but also putting your learners into groups so that they have that peer learning and those peer assessment opportunities. It might be that you start small and you put them into pairs, or maybe into groups of 3, which we find is really helpful as well. But certainly, kind of as much as possible, trying to think about group work is really, really important. I love the idea of let's start a task and pass it on. So it might be a bit of writing, it could be a calculation, it could be an experiment, but can your learners start something and then can they pass it on to somebody else and somebody else and somebody else? And actually that sounds quite like a fun thing to do as well. So we are still thinking about maintaining the curriculum, we're still teaching the curriculum, we're doing it in an online way, we've altered our pedagogy, but hopefully we've kept it a little bit fun as well. Marathon stories. I came across this a couple of months ago. Somebody was talking that they're doing these things called marathon stories, where again, it's a little bit of a similar thing, where they've put their learners into groups and they're trying to get them to write one story, but as a marathon. And the learners really, really responded well to that. And I noticed that somebody's put in the chat box that sometimes learners can lose concentration and interest. So again, it's thinking about different novel ways that we can keep these things going. And again, we have got a webinar next week on just different ideas of how to keep the virtual classroom fun. And again, thinking about going beyond your cohort as well. We have a situation where pretty much the whole world is in lockdown or circuit breaker or whatever you call it. And so there are some really, really interesting ways where we can connect learners to other learners that go beyond their immediate peers. And one of the websites that I've just mentioned on the screen is the Enrich website. So this is the mathematics website that's housed under Cambridge University. And one of the things that Enrich do is that they put up problems for learners to solve, but then they also invite learners to submit solutions. And if their solutions are published, then they're published for the whole world to see. So actually the learners, get a sense of being involved in a worldwide group collaboration project. And they absolutely love it. So again, it's just thinking about opportunities that we can use. Oh, so finally, that leads me on to the penultimate slide, to really just think about trying to make it as exciting as possible. So we do have the primary curriculum to get through, but we can do it and we can make it as exciting as possible. So it might be that we really need to cue our learners in a little bit more as well. And say to them, in this session, we are going to think like a scientist, or think like an artist, or think like an engineer. And again, I don't know whether we do that necessarily in the classroom, but let's think about ways of making it exciting for our learners when they're online, or certainly moving towards a blended model. So really I think, my big message is that teaching Cambridge online, we've got a really, really lovely opportunity here. We can do it, but we do need to think a little bit differently. Perhaps we need to alter those expectations that we have. And then, let's embrace the Cambridge teacher and learner attributes, and let's be responsible and innovative and confident and engaged and reflective. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to take some questions. I'll hand back over to Salisa, who I know has probably been monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box with interest. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So on to question and answers. We will be supported by another colleague, Lavania. She's our Business Development Manager for CAM. So I think to start off the question and answer, we have two really popular questions around textbooks. Parents are demanding that everything is done in the textbooks because they have paid for them. So how do we get around that or counter the expectations from parents that their child should complete all sections of the book?
Think, oh, that's a tricky question. And I totally understand it. I'm a parent, and you think, well, you know, I've paid for this resource. So I think, first of all, it's about communication with parents. And it's about saying that the textbook does offer a framework, but it doesn't necessarily cover everything, and nor should it. And actually, so two things really. You know, even if our learners were in school, we wouldn't necessarily be covering all of the textbook. The textbook is there, it offers lots of different ideas. And one of the things that textbooks authors are asked to do is to provide different activities for the same learning objective. So I think it's maybe about kind of going back to the learning and saying to the parents and reassuring the parents that just because we don't cover every single activity in the textbook, actually your learners are still covering the curriculum. And the curriculum and the learning objectives are the really important area, not necessarily all of the activities that are in the textbook. And I know that's hard, you know, because you think, well, why are the activities there? But the activities are there for choice, because we know that teachers teach in different ways. We know that schools have different resources. So it's not about kind of going through every single activity and ticking it off. And in fact, you know, it might be worth saying to parents as well, we do have the textbook, but actually we do all of these other things as well. So the textbook is one mode of learning, and certainly we will use it as a framework, as a support guide, but it's not, you know, if we followed the textbook, that doesn't necessarily mean that our students would pass checkpoint or progression tests or IGCSE. It's one mode of learning. And another mode of learning, for example, is talking to each other and using peer assessment and those types of things. So I think it's really, really important to communicate to your parents. And in a way, the answer is exactly the same as I would give whether we were in the classroom or whether we're learning virtually.
Great, thank you, Alison. Lavanya, do you want to take over?
Yep, thanks, Eliza. There's a few questions as well. Yeah, the next one is, how do we space out the portion while conducting online classes?
Oh, how do we space out what? Sorry, I have my Wi-Fi.
How do we space out the portion while conducting online classes?
Yeah, again, I think it's a really interesting one, isn't it? That we do need to look at our scheme of work. We need to look at how much time we have to deliver things, and we just need to alter those expectations, as I was saying. So, you know, online learning is very different. So we need to think about kind of how much we ask our learners to do, again breaking into those manageable chunks. But I think sometimes as well, when we're, you know, as teachers, we're very good at talking, as I'm probably demonstrating now. You know, we're very good at talking, and we actually need to stop and pause and say to our learners, it's your turn now. Actually, you know, and that communication can come through verbally, or it can come through written, or you can take a photo, but certainly trying to make sure that our owners have that learning, that accountability, so that we can, you know, we can involve them, we can engage them, but certainly thinking about learning over time, I think, is really, really important.
Thanks, Alison. There's another one quite interesting. Online teaching feels students with special needs seems to be lost. How can we help them?
I don't know whether I've got any quick answers on that one, I have to say. I know I did a webinar right at the beginning of Circuit Breaker, and I know that Cambridge were really looking into the special needs issue. So I think if rather than step on any toes, I would rather direct people to the Cambridge website, because I know that was something that the Cambridge team, particularly the primary team, were going to pick up on, how to support children with special needs. So can I direct people back to the Cambridge website for that one, please?
Another one, moving on. Another person has said that around marking textbooks and workbooks, some parents are taking photographs and emailing them over a weekend. Is there any easier way to do this around and more effectively?
I think, I mean, certainly parents are going to do that. There's two things really. I think the first is that as a teacher, if you set some activities or some tasks to do in a textbook, first of all, give your students, I don't know, 2 or 3 days to complete the, you know, whatever it is. And then rather than necessarily ask for or receive individual photographs or work, as the teacher, I would be saying, in 3 days' time, I'm going to put up a screen, or we're going to have a session where I show you what the answers could be, and I want you to do the self-assessment, self-marking. So I think I would be encouraging parents and learners to actually self-mark their work based on what I'm providing as the teacher. So I think that's the first thing. And I think if we don't do that, of course, learners and parents want to know, well, did we get the right answers? So I think I would be heading that off to begin with and saying, in 3 days' time, we're going to talk about the answers. But if you send me anything before then, I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to give everybody, you know, chance to complete it. So that's the first thing. I think I would, as the teacher, take ownership and control that situation. The second thing that I would do in regard to the textbooks is that I would also set tasks that are not in the textbook, because again, it's about trying to help and train the learners and the teachers that not everything is derived from the textbook. Actually, what we should be, you know, taking as our lead are actually the learning objectives from the curriculum frameworks. So I think I would be tempted also to say, I've got a really exciting activity or a task that I want you to do, and it's not in the textbook. So therefore it's kind of almost kind of by default showing parents and learners that not everything is in the textbook. And then of course I can say, and next week we're going to talk about all of the different things. Now, if I'm doing something like that, I might say, if you want to submit your work to me before we're going to have, you know, the question and answer session, that's fine. And I've noticed that some teachers have really cleverly been using students' work as part of the answers as well. So they've been able to say, oh, we had a, you know, the task that I set you to do last week, Hannah submitted a really, really lovely answer. Here's part of what Hannah said. And that does a couple of things. First of all, it shows parents and learners that you're going to look at the work, that you're going to use it as part of that feedback process. But it also gives that reward, that positive mindset that our learners, you know, desperately need at the moment as well. So I think I would be playing a little bit of a game there as well, which is actually just really effective teaching and learning. So hopefully those two answers help with the textbooks and also the marking of the textbooks. But certainly, if you're setting 20 activities from a textbook, you're probably going to expect all of those learners to be submitting the work. So I would be managing that situation as best I could.
Thanks, Alison. Just a bit more, there's a few. What are the different ways to encourage learners to reflect online assessment and, online classes, and what are the best online assessments they can have for primary learners?
Oh, well, that sounds like whoever asked that question needs to come to the webinar next week. We have another webinar dedicated to formative assessment. But the quick answer today is, what I would say is, think about formative assessment as feedback. You know, our big thing is about feeding back, and so that our learners know how they did, and also as teachers, what do I need to do next? And that helps in both that communication that I was talking about, but also kind of using those opportunities in the online situation to then think, well, you know, did they do that? Do I need to do something differently? And so on. So I think there's a few things to do, but the big one I would suggest, first of all, is this is a brilliant opportunity to upskill your learners for self-assessment. So we really need to help them in self-assessment in terms of either doing a smiley face or a sad face, or giving themselves a mark out of 5, or giving them 5 words to say, I did brilliantly, or I was creative, or, so getting them to do a piece of work and then reflect on the piece of work. We can actually enable them to do that quite effectively, I think, online. And there's several different ways that we can do that, so numerically, qualitatively, with words, with pictures and so on. So my big thing would be, get your learners, first of all, to reflect, but as the teacher, you will need to scaffold what that looks like. And I would also change it up as well. So if, for example, you've said, well, give yourself a score out of 5 for one piece of work, then the next time I ask them to do some self-assessment, I would say, now I want you to draw a face. Draw me a face so that, you're telling me how you think you did on that piece of work. The other thing to do is then what I said earlier, actually put up I was going to say a model piece of work. I don't necessarily mean a correct piece of work, but put up a model piece of work and say to your learners, so what's the same and what's different between what you did and what I'm showing you? And that's a really effective way to get them to look at, well, what did you do and what did I do? And of course, the more you do this, the more you can play around with the piece of work you put up. So to begin with, you're probably going to put something up that's correct. But over time, as your learners become very skilled at looking at what's the same and what's different, you can then start to say, well, actually, you want them to really say, well, I think my piece of work is better than your piece of work. And you say, it could be why. Well, actually, I used full stops and capital letters and you missed a full stop and a capital letter, or you only gave 1 solution to the calculation and I gave 3 solutions, and so on. So I think that's a really effective piece. And then the other thing that I would say is, if you've got the opportunity to, pair up and do some peer assessment as well, because we know that actually peer assessment, learners are probably more critical than teachers, but they seem to be able to take it more from their peers. So again, if you have the situation where you can set up some peer assessment, I would really encourage that. I don't know whether I've answered I don't know whether there was a formal question there about assessment, but certainly something that Cambridge is suggesting at the moment is, don't necessarily rush towards progression tests and checkpoint currently. Wait until your learners are back in school.
Right, thanks, Alison. There's a bit more on global perspective. A few of them are asking if there's anything to do on around teaching global perspective online, and if there's any session to know how to teach global perspective from grade 1 to 6, and around that.
Ooh. I don't know of any sessions yet. I mean, the first thing I would say is that if you haven't looked at global perspectives, you need to go and look. It's amazing. It's so rich. It's so exciting. And I think if you just looked at the curriculum framework or the scheme of work or the teacher guide, you just can't help but feel inspired by looking at global perspectives. As I mentioned, it's a skills-based curriculum, so schools that implement it in lots of different ways. Some of them actually have created a slot in the timetable to have a global perspectives session where, for example, they concentrate on the research skill, for example. Other schools that implement it actually weave global perspectives into all of their other subjects, which is why I mentioned it at the beginning, because it could be a really helpful subject to use to help you to increase communication or research through English or through art and design or through music, for example. So I don't know of any webinars that are currently on global perspectives. I don't think I've seen one on the website under the teaching and learning when schools are closed. That might be one to think about for Salisa.
Yes, thank you for the feedback. We will take that as feedback.
I'd have a look at the scheme of work or the curriculum framework. It's just lovely, and you can't go wrong with global perspectives. You can pick it up, you can use any of the challenges, and you would do a great job. So if you're a novice to global perspectives, just dive straight in and give it a go.
Thanks, Alison. There's a bit more. Some are asking, is there any website to be recommended to do science online experiments or the kind of peer learning, peer assessments?
I don't know about the peer assessments. I mean, I'm going to suggest some websites next week, which are not in my head at the moment, that we could use. And actually what I've done for the webinar next week for the formative assessment is I have divided kind of some of the apps and websites up into compartments, but again, it's not in my head this morning. In terms of science, there's actually a really, really good blog on learning primary science on the Cambridge website under that banner. So the first one that I put up, teaching and learning when school is closed, one of those 4 areas was on webinars. And if you go into that section on webinars, there's a lovely blog all about primary science, and it includes some really nice websites on there.
Excellent. Okay, some have even raised. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, how about one more question? How about one more question, Lavanya? And then we can
wrap it up.
end the
Right.
session.
I think there's another common one which they're asking, since young learners are having issues doing it themselves online, parents would need to be beside them in order to help them through any kind of online assessments or online peer tutoring. How can they work this around?
I think that's interesting, because on the one hand, we would really love to encourage our parents to support our learners as much as possible. This is a lovely opportunity. If parents or other adults can work with their learners, that's fantastic. And one of the things that I mentioned last week in the webinar that we did was that what we need to do in those situations is be really, really clear with our parents about what we want them to do. Because again, I talk as a parent myself. I'm, overly confident, super enthusiastic, and I think it drives my daughter mad. Because she kind of wants to do it on her own. I'm like, well, shall we do this and shall we do that? And she's like, Mum, just leave me to do it. So actually, if the school had kind of written me a little note that said, we're absolutely thrilled that you're helping, here's some really lovely questions that you might ask, but we'd really like the students to do this bit on their own. Actually, as a parent, that would really help me, because I feel like I have to be the replacement teacher. So I think the first thing is to communicate with parents and say, yes, you might feel like you're a temporary teacher and you've got some great skills that we want you to use, but you don't have to replicate what you think I might have been doing in the classroom. So, communicate, write them a little note. There was a PowerPoint that I saw recently that said, at the beginning of the PowerPoint, it said, this slide is just for grown-ups. And it was basically the teacher communicating to the parents, which was lovely. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we want a mixture of what tasks students and learners can do independently and what they need to do collaboratively. So again, perhaps making it clear to parents that actually this task that I'm setting them, they could do this independently. Now, if you want to help them, that's great, but I'm purposefully setting it up so that this could be done independently. And actually, all I need you to do is just to support them by feeding them, by making sure they've got access to a computer or resources that I need. So that parental support doesn't necessarily have to be physically sitting next to your learner. It could be just giving them half an hour in the day where you just say to them, oh, this is, we're going to do a bit of maths today. You have a go. I'm going to sit over here. Come to me if you've got any questions, because I think parents are super, super keen and enthusiastic to help. So I think it's our job as teachers to help them to know what that looks like. But of course, you have to be mindful that they want the best for their children. So of course, they're going to help them in any way they can. So let's help them to do the best job they can.
Thank you, Alison. Back to Salazar.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much, Lavanya, for the really informative question and answer session today. So just one last point before we leave. A web browser with the feedback form will pop up on your screen as you leave the session. So it will be great if you can take just 2 minutes to complete the feedback form. It will most certainly help us improve our future webinars. So thank you once again, Alison, for delivering today's session, and thank you to all attendees for taking time to join us today. So I wish you a lovely evening or afternoon, and take care and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, and stay safe. Maybe see some of you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Indeed.
evening.
Yes.